So neoconservatism gets started in the late 60s, 1970s, and then starts to take over the conservative movement in the 80s and the 90s, and then during the George W. Bush years. Neoconservatism starts out as, well, some of its progenitors, people like Irving Kristol, for example, actually have a background that goes all the way back to the Trotskyist, sort of descent from Stalinist communist politics. But the neocons, by the time of the Johnson and Nixon administrations, they are people who are basically, kind of semi-reformed Lyndon Johnson Democrats. They are people who they like the idea of Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. They kind of like certain programs of LBJ, especially the Vietnam War, but they don't necessarily like the welfare state as it has grown under the Great Society of LBJ. They think maybe that's going a little too far and is being detrimental to marriage, for example. And the neocons are also they really don't like the cultural leftism that the Democratic Party starts to incorporate at that point. So the neoconservatives, they don't like the idea that Black radicalism is on the rise and that criticisms of Israel in particular are on the rise within the Democratic Party. And so they start shifting to the middle and to the Republican Party eventually. And they sort of, semi-grudgingly support Nixon, and then they wind up becoming, supporters of certain Republican politicians thereafter, especially the Bush clan eventually. The neocons start out, they're concerned with things like urban crime. In foreign policy, they think that a lot of Democrats are turning into wimps or actually becoming anti-American. So the neocons start out having this, perspective, which I think a lot of other right-wingers would share. However, when you get to the 1990s and the 2000s, the Cold War is over, urban crime rates are starting to drop precipitously, and the neocons have kind of given up on the older sort of urban and foreign policy sort of contestation view of their points of view, the view of their politics. They instead take on a very utopian, Wilsonian view of what the US can achieve in the world through the use of its power, and creating basically what George H.W. Bush called a new world order that would be liberal and democratic and capitalistic. While at the same time, domestically, the neocons had always been somewhat more favorable towards large-scale immigration than some of the older conservatives had been. The neocons are also, they wind up becoming very strongly in favor of free trade agreements. And so the neocons are the antithesis of what you see right now with the kind of Trump nationalist or populist kind of conservatism. And the Trump kind of conservatism actually has a lot in common with what was called Paleo-Conservatism back in the 1990s. And the Paleo-Conservatives were the opponents of the neocons. They were the people who looked at what the neocons were starting to do in the 1980s and said, wait a minute, this is crazy, we need to get away from this. Pat Buchanan is probably the best known name that people would associate with Paleo-Conservatism, but intellectuals like Paul Gottfried and Sam Francis are also notable Paleo-Conservatives. The Paleos, they're an eclectic bunch. Some of them are kind of, Southern agrarians. Some of them are, tough-minded, power politics guys who look to Machiavelli and James Burnham and others. And some of them are, sort of strong Catholic traditionalists, but they all come together to oppose the neocons. And they tend to cluster around a set of views which are socially conservative, yes, but also characterized by skepticism about mass immigration, opposition to large-scale, to free trade agreements, and opposition to an interventionist foreign policy. So again, you can see how they are kind of ancestral to what we now see as the Trump movement.